right now.
Thank you, Rosemary. Welcome, everyone. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. Thank you for being here this evening, and thank you for your commitment to learning. Our league work to empower voters is focused on ensuring that all voices are heard and all voices are counted as votes. As we are all well aware, the 19th Amendment did not give all women the right to vote and had to be followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other later measures to guarantee all the right to vote. Here in Illinois, we are currently fortunate to have protections of voting that many other states do not. And even recently, our governor just signed into law measures that strengthen vote by mail and curbside voting in our state. In other states, not only do significant inequities in access to the ballot exist, but significant efforts to suppress voting are well underway. That's in the majority of the states in our country. The League stands strong for free, fair, and accessible elections. We want to ensure that everyone who is eligible to vote knows that they are eligible to vote, has access to nonpartisan information to be an educated voter, and knows how, where, and when to vote. This evening, we welcome the opportunity to learn about ranked choice voting as an opportunity for free, fair, and accessible elections. Our League of Women Voters of Maine friends were instrumental in bringing ranked choice voting to Maine, and we welcome Mr. Richie this evening tonight to educate us in this area. Thank you.
So as Allison said, today we'll be joined by Rob Richie, President and CEO of FairVote, the preeminent organization addressing ranked choice voting. While Mr. Richie is talking, we invite you to click on chat at the bottom of your screen and type in your own questions. Issue specialist Barb Lamans will be monitoring the chat. Also, if you would like to be part of the League's Google group for election laws, please type your name in the chat. Now I welcome issue specialist Sharon Alter, who will introduce our speaker.
Rob Richie has led FairVote since 1992 and FairVote Action since 2002. He has played a key role in advancing, winning, and implementing electoral reforms at the local and state level, including ranked choice voting in Maine and more than 20 cities, fair representation voting and Voting Rights Act cases, the National Popular Vote Plan in 16 states, and voter access proposals like voter pre-registration and automatic voter registration. He is a frequent media source, including in 2020 on CNN and Matter of Fact. His writings have regularly appeared in major national publications, and he has authored or made contributions to 11 books, including Every Vote Equal about electoral college reform and Whose Votes Count about fair representation voting. He is a graduate of Haverford College, where he serves on its corporation. I am very proud to introduce Rob Richie. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks to all of you. It's terrific that you're taking time on a Monday evening to plunge into this topic, and it is exciting for us that leagues around the country are really have been leaders on this and are learning and getting more involved and expanding studies, and I think have that tradition of league leadership on electoral reform and voting rights is well applied to this topic. And I'll also share my wife, Cynthia Terrell, runs Represent Women, which focuses on the goal of parity for women in elected office and does a lot of really exciting work as well. And so we'll look forward to plunging in. And Illinois has been a state that's actually been quite a leader on some different methods of election that we'll get into today. And we think is a great place to have this conversation about ranked choice voting. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And yes, please put the questions in chat. I'll be sort of talking for a while I do, and just make sure we're going here. All right, let's get into it. Hopefully you're seeing what you should be seeing, and I will get it to presentation mode. So We're going to go through problems of the current system, how forms of ranked choice voting offer solutions, and how you can help. So the current system of your typical ballot, no matter how many people are running, is you have a single choice, no matter how many people are offered. It's sort of all or nothing. You're in for that choice or you're not. Person with the most votes wins, and they may not even come close to having a majority. Here in this example with just 3 candidates, we have the winner having 44. And really you would just say the one with the most votes, but we allow them to win, even with the other 56 potentially actually being much more aligned, and those voters wouldn't have wanted to have the person win with 44. And that's the sort of challenge of that you see in the current system of, let me just sort of make my screen. Okay, there we go. Strategic voting kind of comes into this, like your favorite candidate might be that one with 16%, but you have seen some polls and you're not sure if they can vote for you or can vote for that person. There also is sort of a certain kind of coercion that comes with this approach, where that candidate with 16%, if they're clearly cutting into one of these candidates' votes, there's a lot of conversation and finger pointing about spoiling and splitting the vote and sort of coercing us toward a kind of a binary politics, which has its own set of issues. When it is down to an all or nothing approach, it really does incentivize some of the polarizing and highly negative campaigns that we see out there that could be particularly off-putting. And I think that the practitioners of our politics have gotten better and better at how to do their game, which is actually worse and worse for us as voters. Sort of some of the questions that come up with our current system. Have you ever felt like you had to vote for the lesser of 2 evils and you just wish you could vote for something more affirmative? Do you wish you could vote for a candidate that represents your views, but you fear you do so would help elect someone you actively oppose? Do you wish more candidates could run without fear of splitting the votes? So on the issue of limited voter choice, this is sort of slide kind of repeats that basic point, but it kind of coerces us into this. Allowing people to win with less than 50% makes it hard to kind of expand choice. And then if a winner for, like, say, governor or president or mayor, comes in with less than half the votes, they might have been the one that would have won in a 2-candidate race, but they might not have, and they're suddenly in this position of particular power, running the executive office. When we, as we talk about different levels of election and where votes can be counted differently, I want to sort of lift up the executive office as I think a particular problem to potentially have someone win that most people oppose. They're kind of the 2 choice dynamics of what we usually end up with. And actually we end up with, too many races where actually there's only one candidate. There's, about a 30% of state legislative races actually don't even have more than one candidate. But we much more often have a 2-candidate race. And again, those who know how to slice and dice the electorate with their campaign tactics really have some incentives to basically drive down support for the opposition, because that inherently helps you. So when you see it, like, particularly if you see like outside money coming in, like the big money that comes in a big race, it's heavily negative. And that's because it works, and it's the incentives created by having only 2. So we believe ranked choice voting offers a solution to these problems. One way to think of it is sort of the ranked choice voting ballot. That ballot can be applied in different ways, and we're going to get into some different applications during the course of tonight. But this is what the ballot, how it's different. Your typical ballot, you could just vote for one. With a ranked choice ballot, you're allowing the voter, you as a voter are empowered to say more. You say, well, in this case, the candidate likes Brown as their first choice, but they support Castro over Adams. That's a meaningful difference for them, and it could be meaningful for how the count goes. Ranked choice voting is empowering you to say what your choices are. For the candidates, it means they know you have that power, and it extends the conversation. So in this case, the Castro candidate earned a second choice, probably maybe got a relationship with that voter in somehow, and that made a conversation meaningful that otherwise might not have been meaningful. So this is a a video. We could stop and kind of watch this video. It's relatively short. I guess, why don't we go ahead and just watch the video here. So here we go.
Apart. And it's because elections aren't working for most of us. Here's why. In the US, each of us can vote for the candidate we like the most. But whenever more than 2 candidates are running to win 1 seat, it's possible for most voters to hate whoever wins. Because of the split vote, politicians can ignore voters and still win. Choice gives you freedom to select your choice to win your candidate. Let's say a group uses ranked choice voting to select us. Select the favorite dish, but also have the option to choose another dish. If one photo sees more than one winner, it's choices, just like the vote election. Next is the competition for voters.
Rob, we cannot hear the video.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Sorry about that. Well, hopefully people have gotten a sense of the video. I didn't realize that wouldn't play, but my apologies. So that video was sort of walking through the math of ranked choice voting. It is available on the internet. So as there are a number of other videos. So we'll kind of get back into the presentation here. And again, apologies for not realizing that wouldn't be heard. So let me get rid of something on my screen. So here we're, this is actually introducing another, okay, let me get out of the, the video scene. More ballots. I don't know, it's not doing what I'm expecting here. Okay, here. So one thing that I wanted to kind of clarify that the video showed, but maybe you might not have heard clearly. So let's just sort of walk through a ranked choice ballot. So you saw what the ballot is, and the tally is a little bit different than a single choice election, right? So in a single choice election, you add up those votes, the person with the most votes wins. Sometimes there might be a runoff election rule like Chicago, you know, you've got to again win at least 50%. But in a lot of our big elections, there's not. Now in a ranked choice election, that first choice is like the first round. So if someone wins more than half the votes, kind of like in a Chicago race, it's 55% in the first round. You don't need to have a runoff in Chicago, and you don't need to have a quote unquote instant runoff here. You would have a first round winner. In this case, the candidate with the most votes does not have half the votes. So you're saying, okay, we don't know if that candidate leading is the legitimate representative candidate. Let's run the ranked choice tally. So that you go to the candidate with the fewest votes, and that candidate is eliminated. And those ballots, and only those ballots, are moved to their second choice. So their backup choice counts, so that the other voters whose first choice is still in the contest, their ballot stays with that person, and the candidate who's the people backing the candidate is out, their ballots go to the next choice. So here you've moved to another round of counting. You do it incrementally, just round by round, to try to make as many votes count as possible. And in this case, it still doesn't get you over 50. And then you run it down to sort of the head-to-head comparison, and you have a majority winner. And that's the basic algorithm. By doing that, the voter now can have greater choice without that kind of creating dysfunctional outcomes. You can vote for your favorite and still have that backup. It creates that incentive for the candidates to reach out to voters to have a more positive message. Is it going to end negative campaigning? No, but does it create an incentive and a reward for someone that can both earn first choices and earn second and third choices? It definitely does, and you definitely see that playing out. It means much more likely to get a majority winner for an executive office. And then as the political incentives, and we'll touch base on this more and sort of like what it means for government, is that you now have someone winning who has done more to get there, has talked to more voters, had incentives to kind of engage. What we find that's pretty exciting is that in all these city elections using ranked choice voting, there's, you know, we're now up to about 25 cities, as we'll touch on soon. The winner typically not only gets over a majority in a head-to-head, but actually wins an affirmative first, second, or third choice, usually from 65 to 70% or more of voters, meaning that they've just learned more about the people that they're representing. And I think if they don't do a good job, then they can be held accountable, but they come in with that kind of the wind at their back of having done more to get there. So when you're electing more than one candidate, there's an idea of a proportional ranked choice voting. The majority earns the most votes, but nearly everyone elects someone. And in this system, the same ballot in the same way of counting first choices. So here we are in an election for 3 seats. When you're electing more than one seat, you're trying to maximize the number of votes that count, so that what you now need to win is not 50% plus 1, because if you need 50% plus 1 to win 1 seat, then you've only got 49% of the vote to help elect the other 2. You need what's the threshold, and the threshold in this case is 25%. So if 3 candidates get a little over 25%, they've earned enough to guarantee that they have enough votes to win. And so the count is very similar, last candidate out, sort of adding it up. But the addition now is that if you actually get more than 25%, your ballots go to next choices. This is a system that's used pretty widely overseas. It's used by voters for at least one election in one of their governmental elections in Scotland, Ireland, New Zealand, in Australia, country of Malta, which actually has the highest voter turnout in the world among countries that don't have mandatory voting. And it's starting to be used in more cities here. And it's something that kind of ties into a important conversation that we're having as a country, which is, how do we handle gerrymandering? How do we handle our really that kind of red and blue map, that kind of divided politics that comes from a winner-take-all system, where the person who gets the most votes, or even a majority of votes with a ranked system, wins everything, and someone with 40% or 45% or even 49% wins nothing. That can create the kind of polarization that we often see today in Congress and state legislatures. This system promotes a kind of a shared representation, offers a lot more opportunities for women and people of color. In Congress, there's a bill that's been introduced the last few years, and it's about to be introduced again, called the Fair Representation Act. One reason I wanted to lift up that here is that proportional ranked choice voting system was actually very similar to something that Illinois used to have, called cumulative voting. So cumulative voting took place for your state house elections, where there were 3 people per district. So there was a bigger house. There was 180 members at that time. There were 60 districts, each with 3 House members. With the cumulative voting system, which was a different approach to a proportional approach, but it was one that had the same representation impacts, it basically led toward most districts, usually all districts, having more than one party win at least 1 seat from that district. And so you just had different dynamics of shared representation. So you'd have people of both parties representing the same voters. You'd have some differences within the parties that could then be expressed politically within the legislature. You would be less often see just one party for something and the other party against it. You'd see more opportunities for the kind of the differences within parties to have that kind of expression for making policy. In 2001, 2002, Abner Mikva and Jim Edgar co-chaired a commission about what could be done to help politics in the state, and actually recommended bringing back the cumulative voting system. Barack Obama, who was then a state senator, was the prime sponsor of a bill to put that on the ballot. It didn't get through Speaker Madigan's political lens, but it was something that kind of at least created a conversation that I think still is meaningful. It's one of the few topics that a ballot measure could do in Illinois. So I wanted to sort of get to what we're seeing with ranked choice voting in practice, and sort of some of the learning that we're having. So voters are liking using ranked choice voting. I think, to be fair, the first uses of it are the ones where they can have the greatest level of concern. The ballot looks different. and the outcomes look different. And if you're unhappy with an outcome, you can say, well, was it that system that kind of caused it? What we see is the more often it's used, like the same voters in the same jurisdiction, sort of each successive election seems to be kind of building support for it. So it generally has majority support from the beginning. Typically these have won with ballot measures with majority support, but kind of the voter experience gets kind of more and more positive, both as voters and in appreciating outcomes. The winners do have that broad consensus that I was mentioning. We're seeing some really intriguing outcomes for women and people of color. And even this sort of winner take all ranked choice system where you have to get 50% to win, you say, well, why is that going to help, women and people of color? I think what it is doing is allowing voters to kind of escape kind of traditional boxes for candidates to kind of earn their support in multiple dimensions. The elections tend to always take place where the turnout is higher. You don't have to have low turnout, primaries. This is in these nonpartisan city elections. You don't have to have, runoffs that can be very polarizing. And we have seen some really remarkable impacts. So also we'll touch on how it's really helping presidential primaries. So these are some of the cities that are and jurisdictions using it. There are different kinds of uses. So if you see the orange color here, that's jurisdictions that are using it for military and overseas voters. Actually, Georgia, as part of the new law they just passed, did add it for their overseas voters. So that whole belt of southern states now use it for all their overseas voters. Maine, Alaska now use it for all their big federal races, presidential elections in 2024. So 2 out of 50 and more to come. We had a number of states use it for presidential primaries. These were state party decisions. And there were, Alaska did that, Hawaii, Kansas, Wyoming, and Nevada on the Democratic side. I will say that Virginia this year, the Republicans are using it for their statewide nomination, sort of party-run primary for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. We had 3 Republican state parties use it last year too. So it's one that kind of both parties are starting to build it into their systems. And a number of cities are using it. Keep a special eye this year on Utah, which I'll touch base in this next slide. So it was on the ballot in the last 12 months. It was on the ballot in 8 jurisdictions. It won, or it was on in 9, and it won in 8. The one that it didn't win in was Massachusetts, but it won statewide in Alaska, and then all of these cities passed it. The cities that voted for it on average voted for it by an average of greater than 2 to 1. It's on the ballot next month in Austin, Texas. And Utah cities don't need a ballot measure to use it for this fall, and it's looking like we could have 5, 10, maybe even 15 cities in Utah, including some of their biggest ones, deciding to use it in November. There's a really very interesting conversation going on there with the Utah League of Women Voters being quite involved. Hawaii, where the League of Women Voters is also quite active, there is a bill to use it for all their congressional vacancies. That has a chance to pass this year. So here's some data. So ranked choice voting has regular approval of 70% in exit polls. In average, 68% of voters decide to use their rankings. When you get to something like mayor or something like the presidential primaries, it usually gets to 90% and about 75% will rank 3. So the more people know about a contest, the more that they're likely to use their power to rank. And it's very encouraging that when you have a good ballot design, voters find the ballot design intuitive. They don't have any issues with voting, with ranked choice voting. That has a little bit more about that data about how many people are ranking. Here's some of the data about representation. So for all those cities using ranked choice voting, it's actually almost half of those seats have been won by women. In the Bay Area, that reflected in a growth. It went from about women winning 40% of seats to 60% of seats. And in general, we are seeing not just an absolute big number, but one that has a really promising trend line. And of course, people can run without splitting the vote. A really fascinating one going on right now is New York City. And New York City has public financing, a lot of open seats this spring. And in June, they're going to have primary elections, and they're using ranked choice voting for the primaries from mayor on down. And it's sort of like the average number of candidates running seems to be about 10 or something. It's really quite interesting in a very diverse city, and one to keep a close eye on. So here are people of color in the Bay Area. And this one was, we thought, quite telling, so that we've seen this general growth of people of color. There's 53 seats that have ranked choice voting in the Bay Area. People of color have gone from winning about 40% of those to 60%. But where the growth has been is the biggest growth was in that where there was a white plurality, but a majority minority. So there'd be like, Latinos and African Americans and Asian Americans, and that not that all voters of color cohere against white voters, and it's not that polarized, but at the same time, it kind of created opportunities for those differences to be expressed politically and then cohere around a majority, and just a particular growth in those majority minority districts. Overall, a big growth that we think is quite interesting. Sorry, there's calls coming in. So I'll end with a couple examples of how sort of ranked choice voting can be applied to address problems, or sort of like solve particular ways that we experience politics. So presidential primaries, we've really started to see a pattern that I assume you've all experienced, which is, gosh, a lot of people are running. So in the Democratic field in 2020, back in those 2019 debates, they were having like multiple debate stages and 20 candidates running. The Republicans had 17 candidates running. There were still 11 by the time of the Iowa caucuses. And we think that a ranked choice ballot makes particular sense for presidential nominations. Maine became the first state where the government is going to run a primary with a ranked choice primary. We are having parties choosing to do it, as I was mentioning earlier, that 5 Democratic parties did it last year. But we think that's a particular sensible use, and we can sort of go through why. So here's Kansas, where here's an example of sort of how it works on the Democratic side. For those who follow primaries, these are not like winner-take-all contests for a majority of primaries. They are ones where you're earning delegates, and you're winning delegates in proportion to your share of votes. And it's sort of complicated formulas by doing it by congressional district and statewide and so on. So in Kansas, this is just showing what the statewide numbers were. So by the time Kansas voted, Joe Biden had really cemented that he was going to win the contest, but we still found it quite instructive for sort of how it compared to the current system. So between Biden and Sanders, they together got about 88% of the vote. So Warren had dropped out by this time, and Tulsi Gabbard had dropped out as well. Some of the states using it, they actually still had, Andrew Yang and the multitude of other candidates were still on the ballot, and they generally averaged about 10% of the vote, which they also did in the non-ranked choice voting states. In the non-ranked choice voting states, those ballots just didn't count, and there were about 3 million of them that were where the voter had voted for someone who ended up dropping out by the time that they counted. When they voted, that candidate was almost certainly still in the contest. We had one really cool set of data from Washington State where it showed that the voters who voted early, about half of the people voted like more than 2 weeks before the primary. And those ballots, more than a third of them were for candidates who ultimately dropped out. And they were candidates that were still in the race when that voter voted. And then of those who voted right close to the contest, only 6% of those people backed those candidates. So that when you knew your candidate was no longer viable, you of course went to a backup. Ranked choice voting kind of permits this. So the way the tally ran here, so you would drop out, Tulsi Gabbard was the last place candidate, you dropped her out, you reallocated the votes, then the uncommitted was dropped, then you reallocated them, you're down to just 3, then Warren gets dropped, and then you see the final vote total, so 77% to 23%. So Kansas, by going to a party-run primary, turnout grew by about 5 times as much as it had in 2016. And the voters who were voting had their votes more likely to count. And that's sort of this key thing, like your vote should count. And those people that didn't vote for the top 2 of first choices, they ultimately had their votes count. Now it has a different impact when, you know, these are active contested primaries, but it still kind of tells an important story. So this has some data about how going to the ranked choice system allowed these states to have much higher turnout than caucuses, how many people use their rankings first time out, in all the challenges of a pandemic, and people were generally using their rankings. By the way, the candidate whose voters were the least likely to rank were Biden voters. And that was totally sensible because Biden, everyone knew, was going to win. So a lot of them just ranked him first. But pretty much, you know, like if you know that your candidate was not likely to stay in the contest, you were much more likely to rank. And at the end of the day, about 98% of voters across all 4 states using ranked choice voting had their ballot count in the final round. Here's another, and that, by the way, can be done by statute in a state like Illinois. For the 2024 cycle, both parties could use that data the way they wish. This is sort of the way presidential primaries work. They're not dictating a certain way of using ranked choice voting, but they're allowing them to set up rules that make more votes count. So absentee voters in states with runoffs is another really intriguing change where we're starting to see states using this. So this is the problem of overseas voters have a challenge getting the ballots and then getting them back. And it's actually getting harder with today's US mail system and foreign mail systems. And so when you have a runoff election that might be 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks after the first round, it's very difficult to make sure that those overseas voters get their ballot back. So these states set up rules where they could keep their runoff relatively close to the first round and then have ranked choice ballots for their overseas voters. And one state, Louisiana, does it for any military voter out of state. And really, I think to be ultimately fair, could do for any out of state military voter, and frankly, for any absentee voter. And heck, they could ultimately do it for all their voters. This is a local option in Illinois. So that particular practice, using ranked choice voting for overseas voters, is explicitly allowed in Illinois law. They've set up the ballot standards and things for how to do it. It was on the ballot in Springfield several years ago. It won with a whopping 91%. And Springfield does use it and is something that any other city in Illinois has the power to do. So FairVote has a lot of resources on our website, and there's a lot of questions that we can hopefully get into with the Q&A here, but also people can go to our website, find a lot of data. We've got a lot of data about how ranked choice voting is working, and arguments that people use, legislation. And so here's some of the questions that I'm sort of sharing. They can sort of I can go through the 101. There's resources we have for activists that as people get more engaged, there's like a website just for activists that they can sign into and get one-pagers and other documents that other state groups are creating and sharing with one another. There was legislation in 29 states this spring on ranked choice voting, including Illinois. There's a whole mix of bills being discussed out there. The one in Utah that makes it more likely that cities will use ranked choice voting passed. The one in Hawaii still might pass to use it for vacancy elections. There's a few other bills that are still active. But what we're seeing is this sort of conversation about ranked choice voting is really starting to happen. It's happening at the federal level too. The HR 1 bill that passed the US House has 2 provisions on ranked choice voting. One that would require all new voting equipment purchased with federal dollars to be ready to run ranked choice voting elections, and another to sort of study the best ways to scale it, to have a GAO study about how best to use ranked choice voting. And I think that conversation is really starting to happen in a exciting way at the congressional level, and we expect multiple ranked choice voting bills that FairVote's going to be putting a lot of energy and time into. And we have a C4 called FairVote Action that's doing more work on these things. This is a map that's on our website that just shows the mix of groups out there that are starting to work on ranked choice voting. There's been a real rise in the number of state groups that are organized around this. There's a FairVote Illinois group in Illinois that's not a FairVote run group, but we have them we allowed them to share our name and vision of reform. And it's just exciting to see that a lot more is going on. And LIG members are often particularly active and involved. As I assume people know, the LIG nationally passed a standard that kind of allows state and local LIGs to take positions on fair voting methods more quickly based on sort of a criteria-driven approach. And that's something that's we're seeing kind of allowing more LIGs to get involved quickly as things take off. And here's a fun little tool, RankItVote. It's not something you should hold a real election on because it's not designed to be proof from people trying to vote multiple times and so on. But it's been a fun tool that people can create their own contests, share it with their friends, share it with, sort of put it on a website. Sort of a nice way of sort of playing with ranked choice voting. And ultimately, we really do get to this point of having ranked choice voting be seen as just a sensible, normal way to vote, in the single choice system kind of being isolated as something that really shouldn't happen because it's artificially limiting us. One thing I think it's not part of this show, in fact, it's not, but I'll share that one place we're seeing a lot of growth of use of ranked choice voting is, interestingly, is university elections, student elections on campus, high schools as well, which we don't track, but in college campuses, we're up to more than 90 now. And this has generally been, pretty much every case has been just students taking the bull of the horns and saying, hey, let's make our student elections fair. And we have seen just a whole fun mix of college and universities of all kinds. And that's on our website on who uses ranked choice voting. But that's a nice way to sort of see it in action and see young people using it. And one thing that's exciting about ranked choice voting is just how strong support it is among young people. As I mentioned, the one ballot measure that lost last year was in Illinois. Sorry, not in Illinois, you're in Illinois, Massachusetts. But while it lost overall, it won 80% support among people under 30. And I think that sort of tells us where we're heading as a country toward voting, and something we're excited to be working with people on. So that is the end of my presentation. I'll stop sharing.
Oh, thank you, Rob. For the participants, for you to know where we're going, Barb Lymans and I, Sharon Alter, we are the League of Women Voters of Illinois election law issue specialists. I'm going to be asking the first question I prepared in advance. Barb is going to be asking the questions from the chat. Hopefully we'll get to as many questions as possible. My question is not a question regarding operation of ranked choice voting. It's a somewhat larger framed question. Most ranked choice voting has been adopted for municipal elections. If Illinois were to adopt ranked choice voting, explain whether you think it's best to start first with municipal elections before adopting ranked choice voting for state legislative or state executive elections.
It's a good question. And I've seen in the chat that some people weren't able to hear me. So sorry if that was the case, but hope people can sort of hear me now. I would say that it really depends on where people think it's needed, right? So for instance, those overseas vote uses, which are sort of, it's a limited pool of voters, but that's jumped right into statewide use. The first time it was used in 6 states. In Illinois, they're starting with cities, right? So that was sort of the, because it matters more for cities that have runoff elections. I think that Maine, for instance, had one city pass it, and I think it was important that they did. Its biggest city of Portland, Maine, passed it, used it for mayor. The conversation in the state was really about governor elections. They'd had a whole string of governor races. 9 of 11 governor races had been won with less than 50. 3 straight governors had won with less than 40. Sort of creating this conversation like, wow, that's not representative. And people really wanted to jump straight into that conversation. I think the fact that it was used in a city did help it ultimately win, but where the impetus for change was to go big from the get-go. So I think it is something to realize that it really does make elections better. I think that the impetus to make them better usually there has to be something that people feel needs it to be done. I would say in a state like Illinois, where I would say there's a certain weight of opinion of caution around sort of changes, that having sort of kicking the tires, having some cities doing it, showing that it works in the state, probably is going to be reassuring to policymakers. But I wouldn't inhibit that from meaning like don't have a conversation about using it statewide. There are the last thing I'll say is there are implementation issues, administration issues that become you have to be more attentive to, like if different counties use different voting equipment, that's something that really can be dealt with, but it has to be dealt with greater intentionality. And there's a great group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, which really focuses on election administration and ranked choice voting. But that's one reason why a city or county might be easier to start, because they generally obviously have one voting equipment and they can just sort of run it on that one system.
And it's easier to implement then because of that.
It is, not for the voter, ranking is something that they can do across types, but just sort of being ready to make sure you can aggregate the data and have an auditable system and all of these things that can be done technologically. We're not very nimble sometimes in how we administer elections. And I think that the more changes that you're doing at the same time, the more that administrators will be worried about things going wrong. So they're a community that often would probably appreciate ramping up slower.
Okay, thank you, Barb. You're next.
Hi. Several people have asked questions about perhaps possible resistance to people wanting to rank multiple candidates. How does it skew the results if they should say there's 4 candidates and they only rank 2, or 32% of the people who only vote for 1 candidate? Is there a learning curve? How does it affect the ranked choice voting results?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's an important point to reassure people they don't have to rank, right? So you should rank, you say, hey, I have this power. We're not telling you have to do it. However, they shouldn't rank one by thinking they're somehow being smart to do so. Sometimes people can get the feeling like, oh, if I rank someone second, I'm somehow undercutting my first choice. Maybe it's a point system and you're giving 5 points to first and 3 points to second or something, and then that somehow hurts your first choice. And it's not, right? This is a backup. So if you have any difference of opinion among others, you should go ahead and express it. We've seen some different ways, like for instance, Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is the 3rd biggest city in New Mexico, about 50% Latino. And first time out, they had a competitive race for mayor with 5 candidates, and more than 60% of people ranked all 5. They'd had a lot of mayoral debates. People had sort of learned about the candidates. But those who didn't, right, generally their first choice is one of the stronger candidates, sort of mathematically, right? So you're probably okay. But hey, if you voted for one of the 3 candidates that weren't in the final 2, you might have wished that you had ranked a backup. And I think that what we see is most voters do it. There aren't patterns that are at all stark of doing it by sort of socioeconomic group or so on. It is one that you will see voters of all kinds use their rankings, and that's good to see, and sort of shows that it is ultimately an equitable system as well.
Just one general question. How long before implementation was there an education process to educate voters about ranked choice voting?
Yeah, it's interesting. You've seen a lot of variations. I think, so here's the thing that's just factually true. You don't need to really do a voter education campaign for people to get their ballot or go into a polling place and see their ballot and fill it out properly. That's sort of an interesting fact. Like that sort of functional piece isn't hard when you have a good ballot design and good instructions. Here's what you want though, is you want people to feel they're confident that they are doing the right thing, right? They can see that ballot and they say, well, should I rank, or what's going to happen if I rank and stuff, right? So I think you want to create a level of confidence in the system and confidence in the ultimate outcomes. And that's where I think the voter education really is helpful, that sort of first use, because again, the ballot will look different, the results will be reported differently, and it just, like, let's say you change from a voter registration system like your state did to an automatic registration system. So more people are getting registered to vote. Well, you don't really see that in any way, right? You just hopefully see more people that are registered. But this will be something that sort of stands out, so that I think we want to have people have confidence in elections in the United States. And when something is new like this, I think it's important to make people feel kind of assured that they are handling it well, and particularly handling a close election and recognizing that most people sadly lose, right? Like most candidates in a big field are not going to win, and you need to be able to accept that your candidate didn't if you were the backer of one of those candidates. And so like New York City's rolling out ranked choice voting right now. They're spending a pretty good amount of money. It's obviously the biggest city in America, bigger than Chicago, but they're spending like $1.5 million, and some people wish that they were spending more. They're saving about more than $20 million from not having to do a runoff. So you kind of wish they might have used some of that to kind of just create all of the more sort of assurance. But I did want to emphasize that you don't need to for the voters being able to handle the ballot, but you want to for them to feel good about it.
But just as a follow-up for clarity, so if I didn't rank anybody and I just voted for one candidate, my ballot wouldn't be thrown out, right?
Oh, right. No, thanks for clarifying. Yes, you absolutely can do that. The thing that will happen is if your first choice ends up not being a very strong candidate, you forfeited having a backup count, but your ballot will definitely count for your first choice. And I'll say that, those presidential primaries that use ranked choice voting, first time out, right? These were 5 states. There were a whole mix of voters, collectively, something on the order of 250,000 votes or something like that, maybe even 300,000. And 99.8% of voters had their ballot count on the first round for a valid first choice, which we were really pleased to see. And the great majority of people ranked.
So now to get to the other side, what are the arguments against ranked choice voting that you hear most often?
Well, I think the one I touched on of sort of you want to make sure people are confident in the election outcomes. And I think that one of the fundamentally, one of the very potential outcomes with ranked choice voting is the candidate who leads in the first round with first choices could lose, right? That's sort of like why you even do rankings in the first place. What we have seen is that the first time that happens, this is where we've sort of learned the hard way. It is important to do voter education, is you want people to kind of feel that's okay, that's fair, right? So I think that it does put an onus on getting used to something new. It is something that very quickly becomes accepted, right? So you have countries like Australia that have done it for more than a century and there's no chance at all that Australia will stop using a ranked choice ballot, or Ireland, or places that have sort of used it for a long time. Our cities like Minneapolis had a pattern of, like, the first time out, 58% of people thought it was a good system. The most recent one, it was up to like 85%. Like it sort of like keeps growing. But that did mean the first time out, 40% were like, I'm not sure I like this, right? And so that's something that you want to have higher. I think some of the things that are said are not true. I think that sort of limited data, or at least not true in the way it's being presented. It does not hurt turnout. You'll find people that argues that it hurts turnout. I think the data is very convincing to me that it doesn't necessarily boost turnout, but I think the more you see candidates embracing the culture of ranked choice voting, you actually are starting to see turnout go up too. But one way that a data point that seems really telling to me on, say, turnout, but is something that you might see about it, is that when the ranked choice voting contest is after a bigger contest, like say San Francisco or Oakland, they have ranked choice voting city elections at the same time they have governor or president. And so the question is, how many people drop off for a local race? And when you have a bigger race, it's very common for people to skip the city race. Well, the number of people that are skipping the city races with ranked choice voting has dropped sharply in the ranked choice voting era. So more people who are voting for something like governor or president are sticking around to vote in the ranked choice voting contest. And that to me seems to indicate, like, yes, it's bringing people in. But I would say there is sort of more esoteric, last thing I'll say, there's sort of esoteric concerns that are based on kind of a hope that there was a perfect system. Like, is there some system out there that always elects the someone that everyone thinks should win? No, right? So there's like a whole like set of conversations like, oh, it doesn't work every time the way it should. It's like, well, that's true about everything, right? So the FairVote slogan is a more perfect union, which we like because that's right out of the Constitution, but it also is, it's better. It doesn't have to be perfect. So we think ranked choice voting is sort of the best of what's out there that's ready to use. Last thing I'll say about kind of like uses of it, I mentioned college campuses, just kind of an example of sort of, it's used in lots of kind of NGOs and so on. But let's say Canada, there's 5 national parties in Canada. They all run their own contests to pick their own leaders. They can do anything they want because these are just totally party contests. They all use ranked choice voting, right? And they all started in the last 10, 15 years. It's like, it just kind of is sensible. And that's kind of the view that we want to create, but at the same time, critics will say it's not perfect.
Well, as you mentioned, Canada, where they have 5 parties agree to use ranked choice voting, is there bipartisan support here for ranked choice voting?
There is, if you sort of put them all together collectively. And sometimes, like in Utah, it really is actually at the same time, and that's great. It is sad that the parties tend to polarize over most everything these days, and within the context of a particular state, we generally see parties gravitating one way or the other. I sort of learned this the hard way back in the 90s when I was working in New Mexico and Alaska. Both had really strong interest in ranked choice voting because they'd had very prominent elections with sort of spoiler candidates, third parties that had likely changed outcomes. And Democrats liked it in New Mexico, Republicans liked it in Alaska, and the arguments that the opponents were using from the other major party were exact mirrors of each other, not seemingly principle driven, just like, hey, this might not be good for us. I am seeing a general growing acceptance and interest in it within both parties. And I do think that there are at least particular uses of it, like the ranked choice voting for presidential primaries, I think makes total sense for both parties. And we hope it just starts winning in a lot of places and sort of find these vehicles where it can, pass with both parties supporting it. And ultimately, I think one party or the other can move it in one state or other, and then ultimately we can just begin to realize it's just a better way to vote for all of us.
Well, switching gears just a little bit, can you, knowing that Illinois especially is having some budget difficulties, as all states are with the pandemic, can you discuss the compatibility of ranked choice voting with current election infrastructure and the cost to convert if the current machines can't handle it? St. Louis, I guess, went to approval voting because their machines couldn't handle ranked choice voting?
Yeah, they had an older generation of a system. They needed approval in like a runoff system kind of approach, because approval doesn't really work very well with a one round, but they had an approval runoff system. And that was sort of tied to not being able to do a one round sort of ranked choice voting election system. Here's the good news is, in the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, again, it's rcvresources.org, has a lot of really good data. All the big vendors have finally, in a sense, responded to market pressure. Like, oh, wow, people are using this thing. I better be ready. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center also has created its own tabulator. So it's software that can be run. It's federally tested. It's actually being used in New York City. It's free. It's a freeware system. It's open source. So New York City kind of decided to apply it with its, so they're keeping their current vendor, which is ES&S. ES&S will produce the data. And then this software, which is just in the final state certification process, will then be able to run the tally. Almost every system these days can create those data sets. The new standards define what that means with a little more precision, but basically, once you've got the data produced, you can basically bring the data together. This is how counties that have different equipment could ultimately, if they get it into this common data format, then you can just combine the data, run the ranked choice tally. But it also means more and more counties can just do it. So like these Utah cities, I think the ones in Salt Lake County, it's going to be a one-time cost for the whole county, $35,000, and that's all. And then and they have like, 20 cities, including Salt Lake, that are in Salt Lake County, and they can all then use it. So it's become a lot easier than it used to be not that long ago.
Great. Just one more question, and then I think we've taken up enough of your time and want to thank you. But so if a local city wants to use ranked choice voting, do they have to go through their state government, or can their city council adopt it?
I should have come in knowing what the answer is for Illinois. My recollection is that at least some jurisdictions in Illinois can do it right now. Probably you all may know better than me.
I think it's only if you're home rule.
Home rule, right? So
You're
certain
home rule municipality.
And
Yeah.
that's why Springfield could do it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So
Right.
Chicago could do it, for example, because Chicago is a home rule. And I don't recall what the current number of home rule municipalities are in Illinois.
In Chicago, if they did it, let's skip the February 1st round, which could be hit in the middle of a blizzard or something. Let's just go to the April 1 round. And that sort of 1 round election, it's faster, cheaper, better. That's sort of the basic argument for it. And that's what, New York City is going to do in these primaries that are really interesting this year. So it really varies state by state. Like in my state of Maryland, the cities can do it without any state action. The counties need state action. In California, it's like yours, like the home rule cities can do it right now. The general law cities still need a state law to allow it. So I think it is a great first ask for a legislature to kind of, particularly if you got some cities that are sort of interested. But yeah, it varies place by place. But I think like the fact that all these cities that voted on it, like it was really exciting for me to see, that list of cities that I put up earlier. It was on the ballot. Always tense when things are on the ballot. The average win was 2-1, a whole mix of different kind of cities. Like voters are kind of ready to do this. And I think, if there's a reason, you can't just sort of put it in isolation, but if there's something like it's combining 2 elections into one, or there's been like some crowded primary, crowded race for mayor that created a conversation, it seems like voters really are ready to give it a go.
Have any states ever gone backwards and said no more? We don't want to do it anymore?
We've had some cities, and I think we haven't had any cities go backwards in more than a decade, but we did have 3 cities that had passed it, and sort of each had their own kind of like close election or rocky sort of implementation. There wasn't as much attention to voter education. So now we've sort of like, as a movement, not just FairVote, but sort of as a movement, we've learned like there's sort of a better playbook for making sure voters are comfortable with it, working with the jurisdiction on implementation. There's been no movement back since then. So that's I see there's a question about Alaska. There's a legal challenge that I think will not be a problem. So I think that Alaska, oh, by the way, keep an eye on Alaska. Fascinating dynamics. They're combining it with an open primary system. And it's just like Lisa Murkowski, the senator from there, is up next year. And it's just going to be a really interesting first use of this certain kind of ranked choice voting, which is having 4 candidates advance from the primary, all being on the November ballot, and then having ranked choice voting in November. So that's going to be a pretty interesting one to keep an eye on.
Well, we could ask questions all afternoon, but I'm going to turn it back over to Jean. Thank you so much, Mr. Richie.
We truly appreciate Mr. Richie joining us today. I want to say thank you also to all of our league members for staying engaged and informed. Again, if you'd like to be added to the Election Laws Google group, please type your email in the chat. A recording of the webinar will be posted soon on the League's YouTube site. Please join us for our Legislative Hour, April 19th, and Lobby Day, April 26th. You can register at the League's website, lwvil.org. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.